Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The silence in this house has a weight to it. It's not a hollow silence like an empty box. It's dense, like the humidity before a coastal storm. It's been precisely 14 months and 4 days since Martha passed. In that time, I've learned that grief isn't a single sharp blow. It's a slow, rhythmic ticking. It's the sound of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a 1790 Thomas Wagstaff, whose pendulum swings with a measured, brassy thrum that Martha always said reminded her of a heartbeat. I was sitting on the porch of our farmhouse, the wood grain of the Adirondack chair rough against my palms. I'm 69 years old. I wear a Casio Forester, the kind with the Velcro strap, because it's durable, it's accurate to the second, and I don't need a luxury watch to tell me I'm late for anything. My hands are still steady, a byproduct of 40 years as Senior Appraiser for Lloyd's of London. People think my job was about looking at pretty things. It wasn't. It was about looking for the lie. The microscopic gap in a dovetail joint, the chemical signature of a 19th century varnish that shouldn't exist on an 18th century chair, the desperation in the eyes of a seller who needs a guaranteed valuation. I had just returned from the mechanic. My 2012 Ford F-150 had a slight shimmy in the front end. Nothing major, just a worn tie rod. But I like things to be tight. I like them to be right. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sound of the tires crunching against the gray stone was interrupted by a noise that didn't belong. It was the hiss of air brakes. Parked near my front door was a white box moving van. No logo, no professional relocation decals, just a clean, sterile white. 2 men in charcoal polo shirts were struggling with a heavy object on the ramp. My heart didn't race. It went cold. I recognized the silhouette immediately. It was the 1760 Louis XV armoire, rosewood and kingwood marquetry. To a layman, it was a big, ornate wardrobe. To me, it was the piece Martha and I had spent 3 weeks tracking through the Loire Valley in 1984. It was the centerpiece of her collection. It was her soul, in wood and bronze. And there, standing by the rear door of the van with a clipboard in his hand, was Marcus. Marcus is my son-in-law. He's 34, wears suits that are always half a size too small to emphasize a gym physique he's very proud of, and speaks in the jargon of disruption and asset liquidity. He married my daughter, Sarah, 5 years ago. I've always treated him with the quiet observation I afford a suspicious painting. I check the edges. I look for the overpaint. "Arthur!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the side of the van. He didn't sound guilty. He sounded efficient. "Oh, you're back early. The guys from the shop said you'd be another hour." I didn't turn off the truck immediately. I let the engine idle, listening to the rhythmic vibration of the diesel. I checked the side mirror. The movers were sliding the armoire, unprotected, without even a furniture pad, into the dark interior of the truck. I saw the corner of the rosewood scrape against the metal track of the ramp. A microscopic flake of 250-year-old wood fell into the gravel. I turned the key. The silence rushed back, heavier than before. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my work boots. I didn't rush. I walked with the deliberate pace of a man who knows that once a mistake is made, the evidence remains. "What's the van for, Marcus?" I asked. My voice was level. I've spent decades delivering devastating news to billionaires about their masterpieces being fakes. I don't need to shout. Marcus stepped forward, clicking his pen. "Oh, we discussed this, Arthur, remember? The anniversary. We talked about the great thinning. This house is a museum, and museums are hard to maintain. I'm just helping you get ahead of the curve. Sarah and I are worried about the clutter. It's a fire hazard, really, all this old timber." The great thinning, I repeated. The phrase felt oily in my mouth. I don't recall that conversation. Well, grief does things to the short-term memory, doesn't it? Marcus smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind used by people who think they are the smartest person in the room because they have the most recent iPhone. You were quite adamant about it. Get it out of here, you said. It reminds me too much of her. Don't worry, I've got it all handled. I've partnered with a boutique firm. We're going to unlock the value of these pieces, put that money into a managed fund for you, something stable, something that doesn't need dusting. I looked past him. The movers were coming back out for the Thomas Wagstaff clock. One of them was holding the brass wakes in his bare hands. The oils from his skin would oxidize the metal within 48 hours, leaving permanent dark fingerprints. The clock stays, I said. Marcus sighed, a theatrical sound of a man being patient with a difficult child. Arthur, let's not make a scene in front of that help, Marcus whispered, stepping closer. I could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. The contract is legally binding. The truck is insured. If you interfere with the movers, you're technically in breach. Sarah wouldn't want to see you like this, confused, aggressive. We're doing this for you. He signaled to the movers. Keep going, boys. We're on a schedule. I stood there, my hands in my pockets, feeling the cool metal of my Casio's buckle. I didn't stop them. I watched as they hauled my life, Martha's life, into the belly of a nameless white van. I watched them pull the door down, bang, and slide the latch home. You'll thank me when you see the first statement, Arthur, Marcus said, patting my shoulder. He didn't realize that in my world, a touch like that is a declaration of war. I'll call you tonight. He jumped into his Audi and followed the van down the driveway. I stood in the settling dust of the gravel. I looked down at the ground where the armoire had scraped. I knelt, picked up the tiny sliver of 18th century rosewood, and tucked it into my shirt pocket. Marcus thought he was liquidating a collection of old furniture. He forgot that I don't just know what things are worth, I know how to make them worth less. I walked back into the house. It was quieter now. The Thomas Wagstaff was gone. The heartbeat of the home had been silenced. I went to my study, sat at my desk, and opened my old leather-bound ledger. I didn't cry. I didn't call the police, not yet. I simply picked up a pen and began a new log. Subject: Marcus Thorne. Objective: full asset recovery and total exposure. Starting value: $1,200,000. Ending value: $0. The audit had begun. The house felt like a hollowed-out rib cage. Without the rhythmic thrum of the Wagstaff clock, the silence didn't just sit there, it pressed. I spent the evening in my armchair, the one Marcus hadn't touched because it was a worthless mid-century reproduction. He didn't realize it was the only piece Martha and I bought new, the one we sat in while we planned our first trip to the auction houses of London. To Marcus, if it didn't have a recognizable brand or a gold-leafed frame, it was invisible. That was his first mistake. He assumes value is a number on a screen. I know value is the story that can be proven in court. The phone rang at 8 p.m. I didn't answer. I watched the caller ID flicker and die. Then it rang again, at a third time. On the fourth, I picked up. Arthur, thank God. Marcus's voice was breathless, a carefully tuned frequency of manufactured panic. I've been calling for an hour. Are you okay? I sounded so disjointed this afternoon. I was worried you'd wandered off or forgotten to turn the stove off. I'm fine, Marcus. I was just sitting in the dark, listening to the lack of a clock. There was a pause. I could hear the clink of ice against glass on his end. Probably a 20-year scotch bought with money he doesn't have. Right, the clock. See, this is what I'm talking about, Arthur. You're fixating. It's a symptom. Sarah and I looked it up. It's called object attachment syndrome. It's common in the early stages of cognitive decline. I leaned back, resting my head against the worn leather. Cognitive decline. That's a heavy diagnosis for a man with a marketing degree. Don't be like that, he snapped, then immediately softened his tone, the classic pivot and persuade technique. We're just looking at the facts, Arthur. You signed those papers. We sat at your kitchen table last Tuesday. We had tea. You were complaining about the dust on the armoire. You said, and I quote, "I just want it all gone, Marcus. It's too much to carry." Don't you remember? I remember last Tuesday. I had spent the afternoon in the crawl space checking for termites. I was covered in dust and grease, and when Marcus stopped by, I hadn't even offered him water. I certainly hadn't offered him $1 million collection. I remember you bringing over a bag of grocery store oranges, and I remember you asking me to sign a property tax waiver so you could help me file for a senior exemption. You had the papers folded. You only showed me the signature line. Marcus sighed, a long, weary sound. That's not what happened. This is what scares us. You're rewriting memories to fit a narrative where you're being victimized. It's paranoia. If you keep this up, we're going to have to talk about a more managed living situation for your safety. I have the signed consignment agreement right here. It's been notarized. Notarized by whom? I asked. A business associate. Look, the point is the items are already in the climate-controlled facility. They're being photographed for the catalog tomorrow. If you try to pull them now, the early withdrawal penalties alone would eat up 20% of the estate's value. You'd be throwing away Sarah's inheritance. You don't want to hurt your own daughter, do you? The mention of Sarah was the hook. He was using her as a human shield. It's a common tactic for the low-level fraudster. Create a scenario where the victim feels that seeking justice is an act of betrayal against a loved one. I'll need to see the facility, I said, keeping my voice frail, letting a little tremor creep into the words. I need to know Martha's things are comfortable. He heard the ice clink again. He thought he'd won. He thought the dementia angle had cowed me. Of course, Arthur. In a few weeks, once the cataloging is done. Right now, it's a high-security zone, very strict. Why don't you take one of those sleeping pills the doctor gave you and get some rest? We'll talk when you're feeling more yourself. He hung up. I didn't take a pill. I went to my basement workshop. I pulled out a heavy steel-bound case from under a workbench. Inside was my field kit. High-intensity UV lights, a digital micrometer, a jeweler's loop, and a series of chemical swabs. I sat at the bench and pulled the grocery store receipt from the bag Marcus had brought last Tuesday. I hadn't thrown it away. I don't throw anything away. I placed the receipt under the UV light. There, on the thermal paper, was a faint rectangular indentation. Marcus had used the bag as a cushion when he had me sign that tax waiver, but he hadn't just had me sign one paper. He'd used a dead pressure transfer. Beneath my waiver was the consignment agreement. He hadn't forged my signature. He had tricked me into signing a stack of documents I couldn't see, using the physical pressure of the pen to mark the pages below. It was clever, but it was also a federal offense. I spent the next 3 hours at my computer. I didn't go to Facebook or Google. I logged in to the Lloyd's of London internal registry. My credentials were retired, but in the world of high-end insurance, retired is just another word for consultant. My access hadn't been revoked. I began a search for Marcus's name. Nothing. I searched for Thorn Disruptive Holdings. Nothing. Then I searched for the armoire's specific serial number, a discrete mark I had etched in the inner left-hand drawer slide 20 years ago. Bingo. The piece had been flagged for an immediate value assessment by a firm called Apex Equity Auctions. The contact person wasn't Marcus. It was a man named Julian Vane. I knew Vane. He was a gray market liquidator, a man who asked no questions as long as the commission was 30%. Marcus wasn't just managing the estate. He was burning it. He was selling high-value insured assets through a high-speed auction house to get liquid cash as fast as possible. This wasn't a long-term plan. This was a pay-off-the-debt before the sharks arrive move. I looked at the clock on the wall. 1 a.m. I picked up the sliver of rosewood I'd found in the driveway. I held it to the light. Marcus thought I was a confused old man losing my grip on reality. He wanted to gaslight me into a nursing home so he could finish picking my pockets in peace. He didn't realize that I was a senior appraiser. I don't just see the item, I see the flaw. And Marcus was a very, very flawed piece of work. I opened my ledger and added a new line under the audit.
Method: pressure transfer signature fraud. Antagonist status: desperate. Projecting cognitive decline to invalidate victim's future testimony. Countermeasure: initiate ghost protocol. I turned off the lights. I didn't need a clock to tell me that Marcus's time was running out. Subscribe break 1. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. The house is too quiet without the Wagstaff's heartbeat, but the silence allows the memories to surface with a clarity that is almost violent. To understand why I am going to destroy Marcus, you have to understand what he is actually stealing. He thinks he's stealing wood, brass, and oil on canvas. He thinks he's stealing units of currency. He's actually stealing the only map I have left of the woman I loved. I walked into the master bedroom. It smelled faintly of lavender and the cedar chest in the corner, the one Marcus had overlooked because the hinges were squeaky. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the empty space against the far wall where Martha's vanity used to sit. It was a delicate Queen Anne piece with cabriole legs that seemed to dance. Now there were only 4 rectangular indentations in the carpet, like the footprints of a ghost that had finally left. I closed my eyes, and I wasn't 69 anymore. I was 32, standing in a rain-slicked alleyway in Brussels. Martha was standing next to me, her old navy blue winter coat buttoned to the chin. She was holding a thermos of tea that had gone cold hours ago. We were waiting for a private estate sale to open, the kind that didn't advertise in the papers. We didn't have much money then, just my modest salary from the junior ranks at Lloyd's and her wages as a librarian. But Martha had the eye. I had the technical training, the ability to spot a repair from 10 paces, but she could feel the soul of an object. "Arthur," she had whispered, pointing through a grimy window at a pile of discarded furniture. "Look at the grain on that armoire. It's crying out for someone to polish it." That was the Louis XV armoire Marcus had just scraped against the metal ramp. We spent 3 years' worth of savings on that piece. We lived on cabbage soup and shared a single bicycle for a year to pay off the shipping and the restoration. I remember the night it finally arrived at our first small apartment. I spent 6 hours applying a specific blend of beeswax and turpentine, my muscles aching, while Martha sat on the floor and read the Providence papers aloud, her voice rhythmic and soft. "It belonged to a countess who hid her jewels in the false floor during the Revolution," she had said, her eyes bright in the candlelight. "It survived the fire of 1812. It's a survivor, Arthur, just like us." I opened my eyes. The bedroom was dark. The memory of her voice was so sharp it felt like a physical weight in my chest. I stood up and went to her closet. I opened the door. Most of her clothes were gone. Sarah had taken the best pieces, and the rest were donated. But tucked in the back was that old navy blue coat. I pulled it out. It was heavy, made of a wool that was scratchy but honest. I buried my face in the collar. It didn't smell like her anymore. The scent of her perfume had long since evaporated, replaced by the sterile smell of mothballs and thyme. But as I ran my hand over the fabric, I felt something hard in the pocket. I reached in and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was Martha's garden log, or so I thought. I opened it and my breath hitched. It wasn't about roses or hydrangeas. It was a meticulously kept record of every major piece in our collection. Martha knew, even back then, that the world was full of men like Marcus. The handwriting was elegant, slanted to the right. June 14th, 1998. The Wagstaff clock. Repaired the escapement. Note,
The hidden compartment behind the date wheel contains the original bill of sale. If ever disputed, the serial number is 4429B. August 22, 2005, the Louis XV armoire. Arthur thinks he doesn't know he etched his mark in the drawer slide. I added my own, a small M burned underneath the crown modeling, hidden by the velvet lining. I sat on the floor of the closet, the scratched wool of her coat against my legs, and read every page. It was more than a log, it was a tactical manual. She had documented every secret mark, every hidden repair, and every legal loophole we had built into the collection's trust over the decades. She had been the moral spine of this legacy, and she had left me the ammunition I needed to defend it. Marcus thinks he's dealing with a grieving widower whose mind is fraying at the edges. He sees my quietness as weakness. He sees my old truck and my Casio watch as signs of a man who has surrendered to the mundane. He doesn't realize that the mundane is where the most dangerous details hide. I remembered a dinner we had shortly after Sarah and Marcus got engaged. Marcus had spent the entire evening talking about high-frequency trading and leveraged buyouts. He looked at Martha's antique silver tea service, a Paul de Lamery set from 1740, and said, "You know, if you melted this down, you'd probably get 10 grand for the bullion, but as a set, it's just a liability. You have to insure it, clean it, worry about it. It's dead capital, Martha." Martha hadn't flinched. She just smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of hers, the one she used when she found a rare first-edition book in a bargain bin. "Capital is never dead, Marcus," she had said, pouring him a cup of tea. "It just waits for someone with the character to understand its worth. Some things aren't meant to be melted, they're meant to be kept." Marcus laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound. "Well, I'm a growth guy. I don't believe in keeping things that don't produce a yield." I looked at the notebook in my hand. Marcus was about to find out about yield. He was about to find out that the yield of a lifetime of integrity is a vengeance so precise, so technically perfect, that he won't even realize he's been ruined until the handcuffs click shut. I stood up, tucked Martha's notebook into my inner jacket pocket, and walked toward the basement. My grief hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a weight, it was a weapon. I looked at the empty space where the Wagstaff clock used to stand. "He chose wrong, Martha," I whispered into the dark. "He chose very, very wrong." I went downstairs to my desk and opened the Lloyd's of London terminal again. My fingers moved across the keys with a speed I hadn't felt in years. I began drafting a notice of potential title conflict for every item Marcus had moved. In the world of high-end art and antiques, a title conflict is like a virus. Once it's attached to a piece, no legitimate auction house will touch it, no bank will lend against it. It becomes toxic asset overnight. But I wasn't going to send it yet. I needed Marcus to get deeper. I needed him to think he was home free. I checked the time, 3:14 a.m., the exact time Martha used to wake up when she couldn't sleep, heading to the kitchen to make a piece of cinnamon toast. I toasted a single slice of bread and sprinkled it with cinnamon. It tasted like ash, but I finished every bite. I owed her that much. The audit was moving into stage 4.
The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites into the joints of an old man and an old house alike. I didn't waste time on breakfast. I sat in my truck, the engine warming with a low rhythmic thrum, and watched the exhaust plume white against the gray sky. My first stop wasn't the police station, and it wasn't Marcus's office. It was a small, nondescript brick building in the industrial district of the city, the regional archives for the county clerk's office. I've spent half my life in rooms like this. While other men my age are obsessed with golf scores or fishing lures, I find my peace in the smell of old paper and the dry heat of microfilm readers. "Arthur," the woman behind the counter said, not looking up from her screen. "Back so soon?
I thought you retired to the porch." "Retirement is a state of mind, Evelyn," I said, sliding a small box of lemon bars across the counter, her favorite. "I need the property lien records for the last 6 months on a specific name, Marcus Thorne, and his shell company, Thorne Disruptive Holdings." Evelyn finally looked up, her eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. She saw the Casio on my wrist, the steady set of my jaw, and the way I didn't lean on the counter. She knew that look. I wasn't there for a hobby. "Give me 10 minutes," she whispered. I sat in a plastic chair in the corner and waited. In my line of work, you learn that the loudest lies are told in person, but the quietest truths are buried in the miscellaneous filings of a county database. Marcus was the kind of man who thought digital was the only thing that mattered. He believed that if he deleted an email, the history vanished. He forgot that the physical world, the world of titles, deeds, and recorded liens, is the bedrock of the law. Evelyn returned with a thin folder. "Arthur, he's been busy, Arthur. 2 bridge loans taken out in the last 90 days. High interest, the kind of rates you only agree to when the person you owe money to doesn't use a bank." I opened the folder. The technical reality of Marcus's life was laid bare in the numbers. He hadn't just invested in crypto, he had leveraged himself to the hilt. He owed nearly $400,000 to a private equity group that specialized in distressed asset recovery, a polite term for professional bone breakers. He had put up his Audi, his condo, and my blood turned to ice as I read the line, a future interest in the St. Clair estate. The St. Clair estate, my wife's maiden name, my house. He had borrowed money against my home, using a forged power of attorney, claiming I was non compos mentis, not of sound mind. He'd convinced a predatory lender that the house would be his within the year. I felt a familiar coldness settle over me. It was the same feeling I'd find when I'd find a counterfeit signature on a high-value insurance claim. It wasn't anger. It was the clinical precision of a surgeon finding a tumor. I left the archives and drove to a small high-end cafe where Julian Vane usually had his mid-morning espresso. Vane was a man of expensive tastes and flexible ethics. He was the one Marcus had contacted to move the antiques. I found him at a corner table looking over a digital catalog on his tablet. He saw me, and his face went through 3 different shades of gray before settling on a forced, oily smile. "Arthur, long time. I heard you were taking it easy these days." I sat down without being asked. I didn't order coffee. "I heard you're listing a Wagstaff clock and a Louis XV armoire, Julian. Remarkable pieces, the kind of provenance that makes a career." Vane cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the door. "Marcus said you were on board, said it was part of a managed liquidation for your healthcare costs." "Marcus is a man of many fictions," I said. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the clinking of porcelain in the cafe. "Julian, you and I have done business for 20 years. You know my reputation. You know that if I flag a piece with Lloyd's as stolen or contested, that piece becomes a lead weight. You won't be able to sell it to a pawn shop, let alone an international collector." "Arthur, please, I just have the consignment contract. It looks legal." "It's a pressure transfer forgery," I said. I pulled out a high-resolution photo of the grocery receipt under UV light. "The forensic audit is already done. I'm giving you a choice. You can be a witness to a crime, or you can be a co-conspirator. One gets you a seat in a courtroom, the other gets you a cell." Vane's hand shook as he reached for his espresso. "What do you want?" "I want the location of the warehouse, and I want the digital access codes for the auction's private view portal. I want to see how Marcus is describing the items." Vane typed something into his tablet and slid it across the table. I looked at the descriptions. Marcus had gone farther than I thought. He wasn't just selling the furniture, he was selling the Arthur St. Clair collection. He had used my name, my reputation, and my 40 years at Lloyd's to authenticate the sale. He was using my life's work to facilitate his theft. The technical term for this is identity fraud in the facilitation of grand larceny. "One more thing, Julian," I said, sliding the tablet back. "Who is the priority buyer Marcus has been talking to, the one in Dubai?" Vane swallowed hard. "It's not Dubai, Arthur. That was a lie he told you to make it sound prestigious. It's a local scrap and salvage developer. He doesn't want the furniture. He wants the legacy status. He wants the tax write-offs associated with donating the pieces to a shell museum he owns. He's paying Marcus 50 cents on the dollar, in cash, under the table." Marcus was selling Martha's soul for half-price, untaxed cash. I stood up. My Casio beeped, the top of the hour. "Don't cancel the auction, Julian, and don't tell Marcus we spoke. If you do, I'll make sure the SEC hears about that double commission scheme you ran in Zurich back in '09. Vane turned pale. "You remembered that?" "I'm an appraiser, Julian. I never forget the flaws." I walked out of the cafe and back to my truck. Stage 4 was complete. I had the technical proof of the forgery, the evidence of the predatory loans, and the location of the assets. But as I sat in the driver's seat, I realized that Marcus's greed had a secondary current. If he was this desperate for cash, he wouldn't stop at my furniture. He was a parasite, and parasites always move to the youngest, softest host once the primary one starts to fight back. I thought of my granddaughter, Lily. I thought of her college fund, the one Martha and I had started the day she was born. The audit was no longer just about the past, it was about the future. I shifted the truck into gear. The shimmy in the front end was gone. The new tie rod was holding firm. Now it was time to see just how deep Marcus's rot really went. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real.
The drive to my daughter Sarah's house was a blur of gray asphalt and the heavy metallic taste of rising bile. My mind was no longer in the 18th century. It was locked onto a contemporary horror. In the world of forensic auditing, we have a term called the burn rate. It's the speed at which a desperate person consumes their surroundings to keep the fire of their own failures from consuming them. Marcus was burning through my legacy, but I knew he wouldn't stop there. I pulled up to their suburban colonial, a house built on credit and pretense. The lawn was manicured to a degree that felt aggressive, and the Audi was missing from the driveway. Good. I wanted to see Sarah and Lily without the filter of Marcus's performance. I walked up the path, my work boots feeling heavy and out of place on the pristine slate. I didn't knock. I used the key I'd kept on my ring for 4 years, the one Marcus had suggested I return last month because it was a security risk for a man of my age. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of my farmhouse. It was a brittle silence, the kind that feels like it might shatter if you speak too loudly. "Sarah?" I called out. I heard a muffled sound from the kitchen. Sarah was standing at the island, staring at a stack of envelopes. She looked tired, not the tired of a hard day's work, but the sallow, gray exhaustion of someone who has been living on a diet of secrets. "Dad? What are you doing here? Marcus said you were staying in for a few days.
For your health." "Marcus says a lot of things, honey," I said, walking over. I didn't look at her, I looked at the envelopes. They were red-stamped, late notices, overdraft alerts, a final warning from a private Montessori school. "How long has he been managing the finances, Sarah?" She flinched, reflexively trying to cover the mail with her hands. The market is volatile, Dad. He's shifting things around. He said he was helping you with your estate to consolidate our family's liquidity position. It's complicated." "It's not complicated," I said. My voice was the one I used to use when I had to tell a client their diamond was a moissanite. "It's a collapse." "Where's Lily?" I asked, my voice tightening. "She's in her room. She's been a bit withdrawn lately. Marcus told her we might have to move. He said you were getting older and might need to sell the farm and we'd all have to reevaluate our lifestyles." I didn't say another word to Sarah. I couldn't. The anger was a physical pressure in my throat. I walked down the hallway to my granddaughter's room. Lily is 10. She has Martha's eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue that sees through the nonsense of adults. The door was ajar. She was sitting on her bed, holding a small silver music box. It was a piece I had given her for her 8th birthday, a 1920s Swiss cylinder movement that played Clair de Lune. "Hey, Peanut," I said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes when she looked at a member of her own family. "Grandpa? Is Dad going to take this too?" I felt a coldness in my marrow that I hadn't felt in 40 years. I sat on the edge of her bed. "What do you mean, take this too?" "She came in here yesterday," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He had a big box. He said he needed to take my college fund papers and the shiny things Martha left me. He said he was going to put them in a super safe place so they wouldn't get lost when you go away." I looked at her desk. The small jewelry box Martha had painstakingly curated for Lily, charms from our travels, a small strand of natural pearls, a Victorian locket, was gone. "Did he take the papers from the blue folder, Lily, the ones with the gold seal?" She nodded. "He said they weren't worth anything anymore because the bank broke. He was crying, Grandpa. He was angry crying." The blue folder was the 529 college savings plan. I had set it up as a non-revocable trust, but Marcus was the secondary signatory. He couldn't withdraw the money legally without my signature, but he could certainly attempt a hardship distribution using the same forged power of attorney he'd used on me. I pulled Lily into a hug. She was so small, and the world Marcus was building for her was so ugly. "Peanut, I want you to listen to me," I said, pulling back to look her in the eye. "Nobody is taking your music box, and nobody is taking your future. Your dad he's made some technical errors, and I'm a senior appraiser. Do you know what I do with errors?" "You fix them," she said, a tiny spark of Martha's steel returning to her gaze. "I erase them," I corrected. I walked back into the kitchen. Sarah was crying now, the red-stamped envelopes scattered like autumn leaves across the granite. "He took her jewelry, Sarah. He took her college fund documents." "He said we were in trouble, Dad. He said if he didn't get the cash by Friday, men were going to come to the house. He said it was your fault for being stingy with the estate." I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up one of the late notices. It was from a firm called Blackwood Holdings, the same distressed asset group I'd seen in the county records. Marcus wasn't just a thief, he was a coward. He was hiding behind a 10-year-old girl's pearls and a dead woman's furniture because he was too small to face the consequences of his own vanity. Technical accuracy is everything in a reckoning. Marcus had now crossed from civil fraud into a much darker territory, the exploitation of a minor's trust and the theft of fiduciary assets. In the eyes of the IRS and the state attorney, he wasn't just a bad son-in-law anymore. He was a predator. "Sarah," I said, my voice as cold and hard as a winter frost, "I need you to take Lily and go to your Aunt June's house. Don't tell Marcus. Don't answer his calls. Just pack a bag and go." "Why, Dad? What are you going to do?" I looked at my Casio, 4:45 p.m.
The banks would be closing, but the digital ledgers never sleep. I'm going to perform a final audit, and when I'm done, there won't be anything left for Marcus to burn. I left the house, the sound of the heavy front door clicking shut behind me. I sat in my truck and pulled out my phone. I didn't call Marcus. I called a man I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, a retired colleague from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. "Bill, it's Arthur St. Clair. I have a live asset stripping in progress. I need a federal flag on a 529 trust and an immediate freeze on an auction listing at Apex Equity." I listened to Bill's voice on the other end, surprised, then professional, then grim. "I have the proof, Bill. I have the pressure transfer signatures, the predatory lien documents, and a witness who will testify to the theft of jewelry from a minor. But I don't want the police yet. I want the dead man's switch." I hung up. Marcus thought he was the disruptor. He thought he was the new guard moving too fast for an old man to follow. He didn't realize that I've been tracking the flow of dirty money since before he could tie his own shoes. He had hurt Lily. He had taken the shiny things Martha wanted her to have. The time for quiet was over, the moment I would turn Marcus's liquidity into a cage of ice. I drove back to the farmhouse. The driveway was empty. The house was dark. I walked inside, went to my study, and pulled the dead man's switch file from my safe. It was time to stop being a grandfather and start being an auditor.
The farmhouse was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of decisions I'd made 40 years ago, legal safeguards, insurance riders, and trust structures that Martha and I had built like a fortress. Marcus thought he was breaking into a piggy bank. He didn't realize he was walking into a vault designed by a man whose entire career was dedicated to finding the exit strategy before the entry. I sat at my desk, the green shaded lamp casting a long clinical glow over the ledger. This stage wasn't about emotion, it was about the dead man's switch. In the world of high-value asset protection, a dead man's switch isn't just an explosive, it's a pre-programmed legal catastrophe that triggers the moment an unauthorized hand touches the till. I opened a secure portal on my laptop. To the outside world, I was just a retired appraiser checking his email. In reality, I was logging into the Lloyd's registry of disputed provenance. Marcus's primary goal was the auction on Friday at Apex Equity. He needed that $1.2 million to vanish into his offshore accounts before the Blackwood creditors caught up to him. My trap was designed to ensure that the money would never exist, but the liability would be permanent. First, I executed a lien of superior title. Since the armoire and the Wagstaff clock were technically part of a marital trust with the survivor's codicil, any attempt to sell them without my notarized in-person consent didn't just void the sale. It triggered an automatic art theft flag with Interpol and the FBI's art crime team. I didn't send the flag yet. I let it sit in the pending queue, timed to go live 60 seconds after the first gavel fell. Next, I addressed the college fund. Marcus had used a forged power of attorney to attempt a hardship withdrawal. I didn't stop the withdrawal. Instead, I used my old Treasury contacts to initiate a Title 31 compliance hold. In the U.S., any sudden movement of funds from a trust into a personal account under suspicious circumstances requires a suspicious activity report, a SAR. By allowing the transfer to proceed into a temporary escrow, I was letting Marcus create the very paper trail that would lead to a federal wire fraud charge. I wasn't losing Lily's money, I was using it as bait to catch a shark. Then came the technical invisible trap, the veto power. As a senior appraiser for Lloyd's, I held a lifelong vetting license. This meant that any auction house within the Lloyd's syndicate, which included Apex Equity, was contractually obligated to allow me to perform a last-look inspection on any item bearing my personal appraisal mark. Marcus didn't know this clause existed. He thought that consignment was the final word. I drafted a formal notice of physical inspection for Friday morning,
2 hours before the auction. I sent it to Julian Vane with a single attachment, a PDF of his own offshore bank records from Zurich. The trap was set. The legal noose was in place. I spent the rest of the night in Martha's garden. It was overgrown now, the roses reaching out like tangled memories. I sat on the bench we'd bought in Florence and looked at the moon. Marcus thought he was playing a game of speed. He thought that because I moved slowly, I was standing still. He didn't understand the physics of a landslide. It starts with a single quiet pebble. Then the whole mountain moves. I checked my Casio. 4 a.m. I went to the garage and pulled a tarp off my old workbench. I reached for my specialized inspector's kit, the one I hadn't used in a decade. I checked the batteries in the UV torch. I calibrated the digital scales. I felt the weight of the steel-tipped scribe in my hand. I wasn't just going to the auction to watch Marcus fail. I was going there to perform a live devaluation. In the appraisal world, there is something called the poison pill. If an appraiser discovers a fundamental, irreversible flaw in an item's provenance during a public viewing, they are legally required to delist the item immediately. By doing so, they don't just stop the sale, they trigger an automatic audit of origin for every other item in the seller's portfolio. Marcus was trying to sell the St. Clair collection. By Friday afternoon, that name would be synonymous with federal investigation. I walked back into the house and stood in the foyer. The space where the Wagstaff clock had stood was still empty, but I could almost hear the ticking again. It was the sound of the seconds being shaved off Marcus's freedom. He had called me 17 times while I was setting the trap. I hadn't answered once. I wanted him to feel the silence. I wanted him to wonder why the confused old man had suddenly gone off the radar. I wanted him to be just desperate enough to make one final greedy mistake. I went to my bedroom and laid out my best suit, the charcoal gray one I'd worn to Martha's funeral. I polished my black Oxfords until I could see my own reflection in the toe. The audit was moving out of the shadows. The people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. I whispered to the empty room. He just chose wrong. I closed my eyes for 3 hours of perfect, dreamless sleep. A man with a plan doesn't toss and turn. He waits for the gavel to fall.
The morning of the reckoning was clear. The kind of day that, at sea, would offer visibility for 20 miles. In the hospital, it offered the cold clarity of a closing argument. Vanessa arrived at 11 a.m., vibrating with a frantic, jittery energy. She was dressed for travel, a white linen suit and a wide-brimmed hat, the new owner ready to fly out and meet her new life. She carried a heavy metal box, the HIN plates she'd retrieved from the dry dock, and the leather portfolio. "Here they are, Elias," she said, her voice tight with impatience. "The plates and the documents. Sign them, and then I have a car waiting to take you to the new facility. It's for the best, really. You'll have a garden. No more worrying about the tide." I looked at the HIN plates. They were heavy, cold, and bore the soul of my ship. I looked at the documents. I picked up the pen, my old Mont Blanc, the one I'd used to sign 1,000 maritime contracts. I signed the letter of quiet enjoyment and the writ of abandonment. I used the non-standard signature, a subtle, jagged variation of my V that triggered a prearranged alert at my firm. "There," I whispered, leaning back as if the effort had drained me. "It's done. The ship is yours, Vanessa." "Thank you, Elias," she said, snapping the portfolio shut. She didn't even look back as she hurried out of the room. She had the clear title. She had the plates. She thought she was invincible. She didn't know that 3 minutes after she left, I was on a secure video link with Sarah and a U.S. federal marshal named Miller, who was currently stationed in a specialized mobile command unit in St. Lucia. "We have the signal, Elias," Sarah said, her face grim on the screen. "The moment she entered the dry dock office, we captured her on 4K video. We have her on record accessing your private safe. And the document she just walked out with, it's already been flagged in the International Maritime Bureau, IMB, as a coerced instrument." "Position of the Audacious?" I asked.
She's sitting in international waters, just 3 miles outside the St. Lucian limit. She's trying to stay in the gray zone where local police can't touch her. She's waiting for the final transfer of funds from Blue Horizon to her personal offshore account. Perfect, I said. She thinks the 12-mile limit is a shield. She doesn't realize it's a trap. Proceed with the action in REM. The next hour was a masterclass in global law enforcement. Vanessa had flown a private jet to St. Lucia, landing an hour after she left the hospital. She took a high-speed tender out to the Audacious. My silent sentry telemetry showed her stepping onto the deck. She was likely opening a bottle of champagne. She didn't see the U.S. Coast Guard cutter or the St. Lucian Royal Police Force interceptor boats until they were within 500 yards. On my tablet, I watched the live feed from the ship's bridge cameras. Vanessa was screaming at the replacement crew to get us into deep water, now. But the silent sentry had already performed its final task. On my command, I had triggered the remote immobilization protocol. The twin MTU engines didn't just stall. The electronic control units, ECUs, locked the fuel injectors. The Audacious was a 145-foot steel island, dead in the water. This is the United States Federal Marshal, vessel the Serene, IMO 9238441. You are being boarded under a writ of arrest issued by the U.S. District Court of the District of Maine. Power down all systems and prepare to be boarded. Vanessa ran to the railing, her white suit stained with sea spray, her hat gone. She was waving the leather portfolio. I have the title. I am the owner. This is a private vessel under a Cook Islands flag. You have no jurisdiction. We don't need jurisdiction over you, Vanessa, I whispered to the screen. We have jurisdiction over the ship. The boarding team moved with terrifying efficiency. They didn't come for a conversation. They came for the hull. Within minutes, the Marseille mercenaries were zip-tied on the aft deck. Vanessa was backed into a corner by the helipad, clutching her designer bag as if it were a life raft. Sarah stepped into the camera's view on the bridge. She held up her own tablet, showing the non-standard signature I had just signed. Vanessa Vance, Sarah said, her voice echoing through the ship's intercom. You are being detained for grand theft, maritime fraud, and human trafficking regarding the abandonment of the original crew in Martinique. But more importantly, under the law of fines and salvage, because you attempted to move this vessel using fraudulent documents, the new owner, Blue Horizon, is being declared a hostile entity. You can't do this, Vanessa shrieked. Elias signed the papers. He's senile. He's a vegetable. Actually, Miller said, stepping forward and holding up a satellite phone, he's on the line right now, and he looks remarkably healthy for a vegetable. Miller turned the phone toward Vanessa. I looked at her through the screen. I wasn't the man in the hospital bed anymore. I was the senior partner who had just won the biggest case of his life. Hello, Vanessa, I said, my voice cold and steady. I hope you enjoyed the view. It's the last time you'll see the ocean without bars in front of it. You forgot the most basic rule of the sea. The captain always goes down with the ship, but the owner always comes back for it. You set me up, she wheezed, the realization finally hitting her. The HIN plates, the signature, it was all a trap. No, Vanessa, I corrected. It was an audit, and you failed on every single line item. The $10 million in the trust, that's being frozen by the FBI as proceeds of a crime. The main dry dock, the sale has been voided for lack of capacity. And the Audacious, she's going home with her real crew. As the marshals led her away in handcuffs, I saw the fear in her eyes, the raw, naked terror of a woman who had tried to play God with a man who knew the devil's own paperwork. The grand reckoning was over. The ship was arrested, the thief was in custody, and for the first time in months, I felt the phantom sway of the ocean beneath my feet. I wasn't a patient anymore. I was a man who had reclaimed my soul.
The hospital discharged me 3 weeks after the arrest in St. Lucia. I didn't go to the inland rehab facility Vanessa had scouted. I went home, not to a house, but to the main waterfront dry dock. My hip was healing, But more importantly, the cognitive cloud Vanessa had tried to manufacture had been officially dispelled by a board of independent, court-appointed neurologists who found me to be, in their words, infuriatingly sharp. I'm sitting on the aft deck of the Audacious now. The ship is back in her home berth. The Cook Islands flag has been burned in a small ceremony on the pier, and the original American colors are snapping proudly in the Atlantic breeze. Benitez and the crew are back aboard, their back pay settled in full, plus a loyalty bonus drawn from the liquidated assets of Blue Horizon Holdings. The silence here is punctuated only by the crying of gulls and the gentle lap of the tide against the steel hull. It is the sound of a restored equilibrium. Vanessa's legal team tried to argue medical necessity and good faith management, but the Vance protocol was too thorough. The video of her entering my private safe, the recorded audio of her replacement crew discussing the illegal dumping of the original sailors, and my non-standard signature on the fraudulent bill of sale created an airtight cage. She is currently facing a 22-count federal indictment. Between the maritime fraud, wire fraud, and the human trafficking charges stemming from the passport seizures in Martinique, her spiritual retreat will likely take place in a federal correctional institution for the next 15 to 20 years. Julian is with me. He spent the last month in a state of quiet shock, coming to terms with the fact that the woman he loved was systematically dismantling his family's history. He's back in the studio, but he's also taking a Maritime Business 101 course at the local academy. He told me he never wants to be numbers blind again. I opened my leather-bound master log and turned to the final page of the Audacious recovery file. Final log entry. Vessel Recovery Audit, May 2026. Status, hull reclaimed. Title, quieted. Jurisdiction, re-established. Observation: the law of the sea is older than the law of the land. It doesn't care about proxies or specialists. It cares about the chain of custody and the soul of the ship. A thief looks at a yacht and sees a price tag. A captain looks at a yacht and sees a sovereign territory. Never mistake a temporary weakness for a permanent surrender. Vanessa thought she was selling a dangerous hobby. She didn't realize she was trying to steal a legacy built on 40 years of international asset warfare. She thought because I was in a hospital bed, I was a relic. I looked at the silver-headed cane resting against the teak railing. I use it less every day. The salt air has a way of knitting bone and spirit back together. I reached out and touched the HIN plate, now bolted back into its rightful place on the bridge. "We're clear for departure, Benitez," I called out, my voice resonant and full, carrying over the water. "Where to, Capitan?" Benitez asked, a wide grin on his weathered face. "To the Azores," I said, looking toward the horizon, where the blue of the water meets the blue of the sky. I have some charts to finish, and this time the command fantasy is the one where we don't come back until the weather turns. The audit is closed. The ship is home, and the captain is back at the helm. Thank you for joining Captain Elias on this 8,000-word journey through the high-stakes world of maritime payback. If you've ever felt like someone was trying to flag out your life while you weren't looking, this story was for you. Always remember, keep your IMO numbers etched deep, your crew loyal, and never, ever sign a document you haven't audited twice. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Payback Logs. We navigate the gray waters to bring the truth back to port. This has been Payback Logs. The anchor is up. Goodbye for now.